Sometimes a single, really audacious decision can just spark a global phenomenon. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the very beginnings of Nike, and we're seeing it directly through the eyes of its creator, Phil Knight, from his fantastic memoir, Shoe Dog.
Yeah, and our mission here is really to pull out the surprising facts, the invaluable insights from Knight's journey. Think of it as a shortcut, kind of, to understanding the grit, the sheer determination, and those crazy ideas that actually built this empire. We'll look at his motivations, which are deeply personal, those unexpected cultural encounters he had, the relentless challenges, and what lessons you can take away.
All right, let's really get into Phil Knight's initial drive then. When you look at why he started, it wasn't just about winning, was it? What was that deeper thing pushing him?
It's fascinating, actually. He explains it wasn't only winning, but this profound um, aversion to losing. He was chasing this feeling he called play. He described it as this, like, exuberant clarity in that split second, that pulsing half second before you know if you've won or lost. He wanted that feeling to be his everyday life.
And he kind of admits his memory might be, maybe exaggerating that eureka moment a bit.
He does, yeah. But what he says remained a comforting certainty for him, even at 24, was this deep belief that the world, well, it is made up of crazy ideas.
Mm.
He saw history itself as just one long processional of crazy ideas. He listed things he loved, like books, sports, democracy, free enterprise, all crazy ideas at some point. And that foundational belief, that's what really fueled him. Even though he admits he was dizzy with existential angst and fears about the future and doubts about myself.
Wow. So that's powerful.
It really is. It shows, sometimes it's not certainty, but just that conviction in the unconventional that really drives change.
So with that conviction, what was his very first practical step? How did he set this crazy idea in motion?
He quit his job as a salesman, actually muttering "God forbid" as he did it. And then, this is amazing, he bought an open plane ticket good for 1 year on any airline going anywhere. Like a Eurail pass in the sky, he called it. And that whole adventure, the very start of Nike, basically kicked off on Thanksgiving Day, 1962.
Just shows you don't always need the perfect plan, just the will to start.
Exactly.
Okay, so his journey takes him pretty quickly to Tokyo. What was that like, his first impression, and how did he even start navigating that?
Well, he was really struck by the city's desolation, still visible from the B-29 bombings. He needed help, so he found some American guys at United Press International. Apparently, they kind of laughed at his crazy idea of importing running shoes at first, but crucially, they pointed him towards Importer magazine.
And he didn't just dive straight into business meetings, did he? I remember reading he took time to soak in the culture.
That's right, he really did. He sought out landmarks that survived. He sat in walled gardens, reading about Buddhism and Shinto. He talks about being fascinated by the concept of Kensho, or Satori, that idea of enlightenment that comes in a flash. He even had this symbolic moment seeing Mount Fuji, deciding he'd only return when I had something to celebrate.
That shows a kind of reflective quality, doesn't it? Even amidst all the uncertainty.
Definitely. A long-term view.
So when he finally gets to Importer magazine, what was the key advice they gave him about doing business in Japan? This sounds like a really critical moment.
Oh, absolutely critical. These XGIs, they gave him gold, basically. They said, don't be pushy, don't act like the typical asshole American, the typical Gaijin, and they explained the culture of indirection, how nobody really says no flat out. They speak in circles, he says, sentences with no clear subject or object, which meant, you could leave a meeting thinking you'd totally blown it when actually the deal was set, or the other way around.
Wow, that's a minefield.
Totally. And for you listening, it's just a powerful reminder that understanding that cultural nuance, it's not just about being polite. It's essential for actually getting things done.
And he definitely ran into that nuance head on at his meeting with Onitsuka, the shoe company. How did that first meeting go down, especially with those cultural dynamics?
Well, he describes getting the full key treatment, this deep show of respect for the visiting American tycoon. He says he just responded with a weak smile and a half bow.
Oh.
And then came the shoe names.
Oh, man, like limber up, spring up, and
throw up.
Throw up, seriously. I can just picture him trying not to laugh. He actually wrote that he told himself, do not laugh.
I know, right? It just highlights how different things were. And speaking of bold moves, when they asked him about the size of the American shoe market, what did he do?
Didn't he just invent a number?
He totally did. He just pulled the figure $1 billion out of thin air. He said it just popped into his head. And apparently, the Onitsuka executives were just astonished.
Wow. Talk about faking it till you make it.
It really shows how projecting that kind of ambitious vision, even if it's maybe not fully baked yet, can be incredibly persuasive, especially when you're the small guy talking to the established player.
So the real turning point came when Onitsuka actually pitched him on representing their tiger shoes in the U.S.
Yeah, they flipped the script on him.
And his response was just simple, wasn't it? Yes, it would. Then he grabbed a limber-up shoe, held it up, and just said, "This shoe, I can sell this shoe." And that meeting, expected to be like 15 minutes, went on for 2 hours.
2 hours. Ended with all the bowing, and he felt like they were partners, even brothers. And his very next move, sent that urgent letter home to his dad. Wire $50 right away to Onitsuka Core of Kobe.
Just $50 to seal the deal. Incredible. It wasn't about the grand gesture, just making it real right then.
Exactly. Practical, immediate commitment.
Okay, so Nike gets back home after this world tour. What's the absolute first thing on his mind?
First question to his dad, did my shoes come? Then he immediately sent 2 pairs of those tiger shoes to his old track coach at Oregon, Bill Bowerman. Bowerman, who he describes as being completely obsessed with how human beings are shod.
Yeah, wasn't he the guy who was like constantly sneaking into our lockers and stealing our footwear to mess with them?
That's the guy, constantly tinkering, trying to improve them. And Bowerman wasn't just some quirky tinkerer either. He was serious. In '64, 2 of his runners won medals at the Olympics. Later, he was trying to invent polyurethane soles. And writing a book about jogging, he had this belief that everyone's an athlete. If you have a body, you're an athlete. Knight initially thought Bowerman had popped a screw when he heard that.
Huh. It's amazing how that became central to Nike's whole philosophy later.
It really is. And just a quick side note on origins, Mr. Onitsuka himself, he started his company literally in the ruins of Japan. Made his first shoe last by pouring hot wax from Buddha's candles over his own feet. Talk about dedication.
Wow. That puts things in perspective. So this new company, Blue Ribbon Sports, it really started super small, didn't it? How did sales even begin?
Totally grassroots. People would just write or call, asking for shoes, CO'd cash on delivery. That was basically the birth of his mail order business. He tells this really sweet story about his mom buying a pair of limber-ups and wearing them while cooking or washing dishes. He said that sight never failed to move me. His dad, on the other hand, would just grumble when these skinny kids with oddly muscular legs kept showing up at the house looking for Buck, which was Knight's nickname.
Paints such a picture, doesn't it? Very humble beginnings. And as it started to grow, he brought in some key people early on. Tell us about Jeff Johnson.
Jeff Johnson. Yeah, he is a runner Knight knew from Stanford, competed against him sometimes. Johnson became this incredibly prolific early employee. He apparently sent this ceaseless stream of correspondence, sales figures, ideas for new territories, constant pleas for encouragement.
And complaints when he didn't get it.
Oh, yeah. Knight has this funny line. I tell the man Blue Ribbon is sinking like the Titanic, and he responds by begging for a berth in first class. Okay. Johnson really embodies that kind of relentless, maybe slightly manic energy you see in early startup folks. Hugely impactful.
Okay, this leads us to a really interesting early challenge. Blue Ribbon sales are doubling like $8,000 the first year, heading towards $16,000 the next. Sounds great, right? But his banker, Wallace, saw it as a very troubling trend. He said, your rate of growth is too fast for your equity. How does that work? How can growing fast be bad for equity?
Yeah, it seems totally backward, doesn't it? But the irony is Knight actually had a brief stint teaching accounting around this time, a job his dad thought was downright disrespectable, by the way. And he taught the core principle, assets equal liabilities plus equity. It must always, always be in balance. But he felt, as he put it, a little hypocritical because his own company had this wildly out-of-whack liabilities to equity ratio of 90-10. Basically, growing fast meant needing more cash up front for inventory before the sales came in. So debt piled up way faster than his actual ownership stake, his equity. It's a classic startup growth trap.
Okay, that makes sense. Constantly needing cash.
Constantly. And it was actually in that accounting class that he met Miss Parks, who later became Penny Knight. He hired her first just to help with bookkeeping, and well, the rest is history.
Right. So fast forward a bit to the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. Blue Ribbon is there, but it's pretty small scale compared to the big players, huh?
Oh, tiny. Just a meager booth, absolutely dwarfed by the massive presence of Adidas and Puma. Knight said they generated zero business, zero buzz. And it left him feeling like he was still chasing Adidas, but also, in a way, still chasing Bowerman, looking for his approval. It shows those internal drivers founders often have.
And speaking of internal stuff, things started getting really tense with their supplier, Onitsuka, around this time too, didn't they?
They really did. First, it was major delivery problems. Onitsuka was clearly prioritizing their Japanese customers over Blue Ribbon, but then it became outright betrayal. Competitors apparently poisoned Kitami against us. Kitami was their main contact at Onitsuka. Knight felt outraged, but mostly hurt. He reflected on, 7 years of really dedicating themselves to this partnership. Bowerman and Johnson's designs were becoming core to their success.
That's tough. A huge vulnerability relying on one supplier like that.
Absolutely, a harsh lesson.
So this betrayal basically forces his hand. He has to pivot, and he ends up connecting with this Japanese trading company, Nisho. How do they see Blue Ribbon differently than his own bank did?
It's night and day. His American bank saw Blue Ribbon as a total landmine because of the shaky finances, the high debt. But Nisho, they saw a potential gold mine. Why? Because they loved growth companies. That rapid growth that scared the bank, that's exactly what attracted Nisho. Later, when Knight's bank actually accused him of fraud and threatened bankruptcy, scandal, ruin, his future wife, Penny, just calmly told him, Sumeragi loves you. Sumeragi was their key guy at Nisho, their champion.
Amazing how different perspectives can be. It really depends on what you value, stability versus growth potential.
Precisely. It shows how finding the right partner, one whose risk appetite matches yours, is crucial.
And this is also when the actual Nike brand gets born, right? Out of this need to break from Onitsuka.
Exactly. Necessity is the mother of invention, I guess.
Yeah.
He needed a new logo fast. So he went to Carolyn Davidson, an art student at Portland State where he was teaching. Told her he needed something that evokes a sense of motion. And she came up with the swoosh and the name Nike. He says it literally came to him in a dream, the Greek goddess of victory.
Wow. A mix of practical need and maybe a bit of inspiration.
Definitely.
Now, Knight uses this term in the book, shoe dogs. He describes them as people who devoted themselves wholly to the making, selling, buying, or designing of shoes, calls it an all-consuming mania, a recognizable psychological disorder, and he says, I understood. What does that tell you about the culture he was building?
It tells you everything, really. Nike, or Blue Ribbon back then, wasn't just staffed by employees clocking in and out. It was built by people with this almost like irrational passion for the product itself, this mania. And that's often the secret ingredient, isn't it? That obsessive focus is what lets you push through endless setbacks and really disrupt an industry. It's about the shoe, the run, not just the bottom line.
Right. And related to that, there's that surprising anecdote about truth-telling. Can you share that?
Yeah, it's great. At one point, a factory owner in Japan tells Knight, we know that you guys tell the truth. Everyone else bullshits. You guys always shoot straight. And Jeff Johnson's reaction was apparently just, who knew? Well, Knight himself admits he tried not to think about my many half-truths and untruths with Onitsuka.
Huh. That's quite the admission.
It is. It makes you think, doesn't it? How much of perceived integrity in business is about actually being squeaky clean versus just being maybe less dishonest in the competition? Food for thought.
Definitely. Now, the early 70s were a turbulent time globally. The Munich Olympics massacre in 72 really shook Knight, made him question what's the point. But somehow, despite that darkness, the business itself really started picking up steam, especially with Steve Prefontaine.
Yeah, Prefontaine was huge, this legendary rebellious runner wearing Nikes, setting American records. Knight says he generated thousands of dollars of publicity, made Nike this symbol of rebellion and iconoclasm. It was exactly the image they needed.
And this links back to those earlier legal fights too, right, with Onitsuka?
It does. Knight actually acknowledges in the book writing a memo about potentially hiring a spy and definitely borrowing Kitami's folder during a visit to Japan, basically getting insider info. He reflects on that MacArthur quote, you are remembered for the rules you break. But ultimately, he decides he needs to play it straight in the legal battle. He also had this really clear understanding, he writes, that supply and demand is always the root problem in business.
So you see him wrestling with these huge pressures, internal doubts, global crises, fierce competition, ethical lines, and just fundamental business mechanics.
All at once. It's the founder's crucible, really.
By the mid-70s, the company's growth is causing unprecedented problems again. Cash flow is still the issue. And Knight's attitude is just grow or die. He refuses to order less inventory, even though it's forever pushing my conservative bankers to the brink. What did this relentless growth push lead to?
Well, ironically, it also led to this deep reluctance, initially, to go public. They actually talked about it seriously in 1976. But the consensus was no. They were afraid it would change our culture, make us beholden, make us corporate. Knight said, that's not our play. It's that classic founder's tension, you know. Scaling up often means giving up some control, becoming more structured, which can feel like losing the original soul, that crazy idea.
But even with all that financial stress, they had these legendary internal meetings. Tell us about the butt faces meetings, that name alone.
Huh? Yeah, the butt faces meetings. They'd hole up in Oregon resorts like Sun River for 2 or 3 days, shouting ourselves hoarse, as Knight puts it. But he says they were always filled with laughter, too. Intense debate, but deep connection. He describes feeling overcome by emotion, camaraderie, loyalty, gratitude, even love. And he looked around at the team he'd built. He mentions a paralyzed guy, 2 morbidly obese guys, a chain-smoking guy. And was kind of shocked, realizing maybe he had the most in common with Johnson, the intense correspondent. It wasn't just team building. It was like forging this unconventional tribe, bound by loyalty that went way beyond a typical corporate structure.
That sounds incredibly unique, a real source of strength, I bet.
Absolutely. That kind of deep camaraderie built
Yeah.
in those intense sessions, that's hard to break.
So if they were so against going public, what finally tipped the scales? What made it unavoidable?
It took an outsider with serious clout. Chuck Robinson, a former high-ranking State Department official, basically sat Knight down. And he told him, point blank, it was mandatory. Solve the cash flow problem by going public, or you will lose the company, period. Knight said the assessment was frightening, but also necessary. It made him realize going public was inevitable. Even though it made him sad, because as he insists throughout the book, getting rich had never factored in my decisions.
A tough realization. Sometimes the practical reality just forces your hand, even if it clashes with your philosophy.
Exactly. Survival sometimes dictates the path.
And amidst all this business pressure, he was also dealing with something deeply personal involving his family, wasn't he?
He was. He talks about how his whole life, his business, even his bond with his own father, was so centered around sports. But neither of his 2 sons had any interest in it at all. And that created, in his words, a kind of fissure deep within the bedrock of my existence. It was a really poignant reminder, that massive professional success doesn't automatically translate to fulfillment in every part of life.
Definitely puts things in perspective. But even with these struggles, innovation didn't stop. Tell us about the Air shoe. How did that come about?
Ah, the Nike Air. Yeah, this guy, M. Frank Rudy, an aerospace engineer, comes to them. Initially presents the idea with just inscrutable numbers on a blackboard. The concept was putting encapsulated gas air into the sole for better cushioning. Revolutionary idea. But the early designs weren't perfect. Like, one had a flared heel that actually caused pronation problems for runners. They had to do a product recall.
Ouch. A recall sounds bad. What was the reaction?
That's the amazing part. Instead of backlash, Knight says they got gratitude. People saw it as progress. All innovation was hailed as progressive. Their customers were so loyal and so bought into the idea of Nike pushing boundaries that even a failure wasn't seen as a failure, but as part of the process.
That's incredible customer loyalty. It shows the power of building that brand identity around innovation itself.
Exactly. The willingness to try, even if you stumble, can build even deeper trust than playing it safe.
Okay, moving towards the end of the 70s, 1979. Knight has this major battle with U.S. Customs right. He calls the official the Bureau Kraken.
Yeah, a huge fight over import duties that threatened to bankrupt them. It got serious. Senators Hatfield and Packwood from Oregon had to intervene. Apparently, the customs official finally told Knight he was sick and tired of hearing from your high-placed friends.
And Knight's response?
Classic Knight defiance. You'll be hearing from them until this situation is resolved. It just shows he was ready to fight tooth and nail, using every lever he had, political or otherwise, to protect his company. Real tenacity.
So this all leads, finally, to the IPO, December 2nd, 1980. His advisor suggests $20 a share, but Knight pushes back hard, doesn't he?
He insists on $22. His reasoning: we'd earned that number, we deserve to be on the high end of the price range. He even pointed to Apple, which was going public the very same week, also at 22.2s, and Knight basically said we were worth as much as them. He was ready to walk away from the whole IPO if they didn't get that press.
That took guts, comparing themselves to Apple back then.
Huge guts. It speaks volumes about his belief in what they'd built. Not just the financials, but the brand, the potential.
So the IPO happens at $22. How did Knight feel on that day? Was it pure celebration? Relief?
It's fascinating. He writes, it wasn't joy, it wasn't relief. If I felt anything, it was regret. He says he honestly wished I could do it all over again. The journey, the struggle. He woke up the next day, looked around, and realized nothing had changed. least of all me, and yet I was worth $178 million.
Wow, that really underscores that for him, the true shoe dog, the building was the reward, maybe more than the destination.
Seems that way, doesn't it? The process was the prize.
So wrapping this up, what are the big takeaways for you, our listener? Phil Knight's story, those early Nike days, it's such a powerful testament that, yeah, crazy ideas really can change the world. But man, it takes that relentless dedication, navigating just incredible cultural and financial hurdles, and having the guts sometimes to, well, break the rules or know when to play it straight.
And it absolutely highlights the personal costs, the sacrifices involved, that constant pressure of grow or die, he felt. But what's also interesting, looking beyond the book's time frame, is how Nike, years later, actually became a leader in pushing for factory reform. They were even recognized by the UN eventually as setting the gold standard for apparel factories. It shows how those early struggles, maybe even mistakes, can eventually drive positive change and a sense of responsibility.
Yeah, that's a great point. And maybe the ultimate lesson is in his own later reflection. He admits seeing another crazy idea still on his bucket list. He says there's so much to do, so much to learn, so much I don't know about my own life. Still searching, still learning.
Which leads to maybe a final provocative thought for you to chew on. Knight himself observed something interesting. He said, America isn't the entrepreneurial Shangri-La people think. He even cites a Harvard Business School study that apparently ranked America behind Peru in entrepreneurial spirit. So here's the question for you. In a world that often, let's be honest, tries to squash crazy ideas and really values conformity, how can you actively cultivate and champion that spirit? That spirit of daring innovation, of relentless pursuit in your own life, your own work, even if it means embracing feeling a little bit crazy yourself sometimes.